So as we went through that Lean BIM journey, we found that we found. You found it. Did we find that we found?
Did.
So as we went through that Lean BIM journey, we found 5 key lessons, 5 Lean BIM lessons that we learned, and we'll take you through those now. The first was smaller batches. The second was sequencing elements. The third was about bringing teams together to collaborate and communicate. The fourth was that sticky notes kind of suck when it comes to pull planning. And the fifth was the combination of both technology and also in-person meetings was really the best way to go. So let's take a look. The first one, smaller batches. Instead of in a design process having a very long phase or a big long stage where you can build up questions and have a lot of waste.
Yeah. They found it more manageable to have smaller batches that were a lot more manageable, but you can
bite-sized pieces.
Yeah, you can keep track of them better.
You can make sure that you finish something and then move on to the next, and you can put that behind you. It's much easier as well. We found not something to go on in the first few phases in the design or the stages in the design process where lots of things are in flux. Much more manageable in later design stages that we're able to define exactly what's required inside of that stage. And also being able to, when you've got that more manageable batch stage-based approach, being able to start the right people at the right time was really so much easier.
Yeah, so the second thing we learned was when you can manage them in bite-sized pieces, you can then focus on what's the priority of those elements that you need for that milestone or for that week or for that month even.
So we saw in one of the videos was 6 BIM wastes where you could see where the element sequence, if it wasn't correct, then it could result in a constructible and clash-free model, but not the optimum result. So this image is just depicting how very generalized we can, in a generalized way, we can have an element sequence that we fix some of the more strict, some of the more the base, the foundations for the building, like the architectural and structural. Right. And then as we fill out the building with different systems, they are prioritized based on their importance or based on how much it would cost to change that or how flexible the system is. And we always look and think, oh, the branch lines on the fire protection being at the top of this tree, that's great for the teams modeling those elements because they model them once. Right. They don't have to come back and rework them. They'll be able to get in there at the right time to model their own elements.
And they're more confident in what they're going to model that one time. So in a typical coordination process, they might be the ones that are always getting dictated as to where they need to be modeled because they're more flexible. But having sequences, they can then either wait or see when the structural beams are going to be placed, and then they can model around it and do it one time.
And it's not the full scope we're talking about there, it's certain sets or systems within people's scope. Yeah. So some, for example, the risers, the mains where the water is coming into the building and rising up through a building, for example, even though it's fire protection, that is not delayed all the way to the end. They are things that will be prioritized earlier, so gravity systems, etc. Really important to get a sequence correct. And then the third one,
collaboration.
Involving teams, engaging people's input earlier and making sure you have great conversations. And from a lean perspective, pull planning is a really useful tool, technique, approach that people can have those conversations a lot earlier, have the discussions to understand what the constraints are that need to be removed in order for them to carry out their work.
And allowing the right people to give that information. So getting the right people involved early on and developing a scope together is more likely to get executed or completed than having one scope get dictated by one company, one consultant.
And it allows those conversations, and as a result, you get more reliable promises. You get an engaged team, and you're able to then deliver to that original set of objectives within certain milestones. It's a really important thing. The last planner, the person responsible for managing or actually carrying out the work is involved in those planning conversations.
So where would pull planning be useful?
It can be useful in many different phases in the design process, but also at different levels of granularity. And we have master planning, milestone planning, phase planning, and weekly work planning. where we've seen the most benefit is managing the trades that are going to be creating model elements, building out the systems inside of the building, and managing that at the phase and the weekly work planning level. So we're between milestones, we have a set of tasks that we can then run the pull planning workflow. We can understand constraints, we can understand the handoffs between those trades, and understand what they need in order to be able to give their work to others. And then manage those tasks and checklists in a weekly work planning exercise. And we'll talk more about that in another video as well.
So in the pull planning process, you might be familiar with using these sticky notes. And what we've found is that they're a bit boring. And
sticky notes suck.
They suck.
When you start a pull planning session and everyone's got blank sticky notes and blank looks on their faces,
what do you do?
Where do you need a facilitator? Yeah. And facilitating a pull planning session can sometimes be really tough to try and get people's engagement, try to get people to start understanding what their scope is, their commitments, having those discussions between each other. But what we found,
a waste of time in a meeting that's already going to take 4 hours.
How can you expedite that? How can you start off with some really rich images on the cards, already assigned scope that's been collaboratively agreed? So how can we start with rich information on those cards that's already been agreed and accelerate that pull planning workflow? Something that we also will introduce later on. And then the fifth one was, okay, you could just do pull planning or run lean processes with technology, or you could just run them using an in-person, tactile approach. But what we've seen is the optimum results occur when we combine both of those methods. Being able to create cards that people can have conversations with in person, but then also being able to capture those commitments and run, track, control, manage those as we get the project completed. So there are the 5 that we learned. There were actually many more, but boiled down to give 5 lessons that we learned. 1, smaller batches made it easier to carry out the work.
2, sequence of elements.
The third one was teams and their input, being engaged in the planning process and having those people that were delivering the work sequence the work, as we said, in the right stages.
Post-it notes suck, so maybe a more of a visual approach and less misunderstandings would help those pull planning meetings.
Automate that workflow. Yes. You've already got a scope, you've already got some images. Why not press print? That was something that we should definitely give credit to the CEO at Panko for. And these were all of the lessons that we learned as we went through around different companies validating workflows. And the fifth one is that you can't just do this with technology. You can't just do this in a practical way with just an in-person workflow because people work in different offices, different locations. So the combination of both the technology and also the in-person tactile experience is essential to get the optimum benefits. So that's what we learned. There are the 5 lessons that we learned when we're combining BIM and Lean to have a Lean BIM workflow.